So with Spider-Verse coming back on Monday, I thought it'd be fun to take a quick break away from the Spider-Verse stories by getting into a discussion about Galactus. And the reason why I chose Galactus here is because this is a character who is very pivotal to the Marvel continuity and to the existence in Marvel Comics, but is a character we haven't really talked about that much. Discussed stories involving Galactus. We've talked about characters that are tied closely to Galactus. For example, I guess the Silver Surfer and Franklin Richards, but we've never actually gotten into a discussion about Galactus proper. So Galactus first appeared in 1966 with what many fans refer to as the Galactus trilogy. And of course, Galactus was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And in 2011, the Comic Book Journal had released an interview they had done with Stan Lee where they had asked him about Galactus, about why it is that Galactus was created. And what Stan Lee tells us here is that Galactus was created because Marvel at the time, when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were really kind of the 1-2 punch during the Silver Age, were looking towards characters and villains that would break the standard for what villains were at the time. In Marvel Comics, when you had the 1960s, when you had Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, Thor, and so on, despite the power of some of these characters, a lot of the villains were still street-level thugs. There were still villains who, for whatever reason, developed some measure of abilities, but their schemes were always superficial. They always intended to somehow amass a great amount of wealth or something like that. The villains would be defeated by the superheroes, they would be handed over to the authorities, and the villains would be incarcerated. The villains would then break out of jail, and the entire process would start over again. This was really a timeless relationship between superheroes and supervillains dating all the way back to the Golden Age. And so Stan Lee and Jack Kirby wanted to break this standard, and so they introduced the concept of Galactus. And as Stan Lee tells us, this character of Galactus has to be somebody major. He had to be a character who was so powerful that he really couldn't be stopped per se. He could simply just be staved off. And so when he introduced the idea to Jack Kirby had of course returned with a depiction of Galactus that we had seen in the original Galactus trilogy, but he had also introduced the Silver Surfer. And of course we'll get into this when we get into the Heralds of Galactus. But with Galactus's original introduction here, what I'd like you to take note of is that Galactus seems very disconnected with regards to his actions. He doesn't really seem to care about his effect on the planet Earth, about the fact that he's basically killing the entire citizenry, or I guess the entire inhabitants of the planet Earth, to satiate his own appetite. And indeed, this is the entire element for the basis of the Silver Surfer turning against Galactus in the original Galactus trilogy and helping the Fantastic Four defeat Galactus. And this will be a major focal point for the character. This will be a major part of who he is and his personality going up until we actually get into his discussion with Mistress Death in the Fantastic Four issue number 257. But before we get into that, what we had found was that Marvel had come along in Thor issues number 168 and 169 and given us the origin of Galactus. But again, what's really interesting here is that while this was an origin that was perceived, and it was really the standard created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, in 1996, Marvel had come back and they had basically revamped this origin to a degree. That is to say, they had basically expanded on this with a little bit more information. And the original Thor series and the original, origin that was given to us in Thor, what Marvel had told us was that he had existed in the universe before the current Earth 616 continuity, and that at some point along the line, a plague began to spread across that universe, and as a result, it began killing off all forms of sentient life. Galen's entire role during the course of his existence in this continuity was to find a way to bring this plague to an end, but he was unsuccessful. And so when he had traveled back to the home planet, basically telling the scientists of his age that defeat and that death was imminent, they had decided the best way for them to meet death was to meet it in a way that was befitting of their culture. And so what they had done is they had simply flown into a star and were perceived to have been killed. And then in some form or fashion, Galactus had come into existence in the current continuity. Now, what Marvel did again in 1996 is they added a little more to the story to make it make a little more sense, because again, we were really kind of jumping around with the origin that we saw in Thor. There were a lot of dots that were connected, but we really didn't see how A got to B. All we knew was that it's somewhere along the line, the dots drew from one to the other. And so in this origin story, what Marvel does here is they keep the entire concept of a plague, but what they say is that when Galen and his, this handful of the members of his race that were still alive had flown into this star, while all the other members of the race had been killed, the sentience of this galaxy had spoken directly with Galactus. And what it did, with Galen, and what it had told Galen is that the impending end of the universe is coming. There's no way to bring it to an end, but that the death of this universe will give birth to a new one. And so what's going to happen is that this sentience of this universe is going to bond itself with Galen, and they will be born into the new universe universe as a singular being. And so when the new universe came into existence, Galactus was spit out, and he was spit out in the form of his ship that he had previously taken, or I guess he had previously been occupying before the universe came to an end. Now, Marvel doesn't really give us a time frame here in terms of when he had first, I guess, been spit out at the formation of the universe and when he took on the form of Galactus. All they tell us is that several millennia had passed, and during the time when he actually comes and is revealed in the form of Galactus and the time that he was spit out, he had been discovered, or a ship had been discovered by a Watcher. Now, this is not Uatu the Watcher. This is simply just another member of the Watcher's race. And what this Watcher realizes is that there seems to be a vast amount of power coming from the individual in the ship. And the way that he discovers that is that he actually pulls the ship down to his own planet and begins examining the occupants inside. Now, the possibility existed that he could very well have destroyed this version before it had, I guess, usurped and developed all these different abilities, but because of the creed of the Watchers, because the Watchers exist to simply chronicle and never intervene, this Watcher took no action. And so as a result, the ship went back into its orbit and it began traveling through the cosmos once more. Now, eventually this ship comes across another planet, and the occupants, or I guess the natives of this planet, again, don't really know what to do. They don't really know what to make of this ship. But what happens is they simply leave the ship alone, and during this time, the ship begins to take on a different form. It begins to actually change itself into more of a cube. And during this time, it really becomes an incubation chamber for Galactus. And what he does is he begins to come to grips with his power. He begins to channel his energies. He actually develops the outfit that we see him wear during his time in Marvel Comics that allows him to regulate his energies more or less. And so ultimately, as time progresses, again, as millennia go by, this planet, along with several others in this portion of the galaxy, engage in some kind of a conflict. And as a result, the invading forces see this cube of Galactus, and when they do, they perceive it to be some kind of a weapon. And so what they do is they attack this ship, and when they destroy it, Galactus emerges. Now, Galactus, of course, being that he's been incubating all this time, developing his abilities, has a vast amount of hunger here. And so what he does is he destroys the invaders, and then he immediately begins consuming the planet. And this is the role that Galactus is going to play for almost his entire existence in the Marvel continuity. As far as we know, he's a character that's constantly going to travel around and consume other planets. And again, this led directly up to the Galactus trilogy, when Galactus, again, not really concerning himself with the goings on of the occupants of the planets, would consume those planets and then move on to the next. Now, what we find in Fantastic Four issue number 257 in 1983 is that Marvel was looking to move forward. Marvel was looking to introduce not just characters that, again, were cosmic level threats like Galactus, but they wanted to expand on the nature of characters in the sense of these cosmic level beings having all different manner of feelings, all different manner of emotions. And so Marvel really couldn't stay with this idea of Galactus being a character who was so removed from the ramifications of his actions. And so what we saw in the story is that Galactus begins to appeal with Mistress Death. He begins to speak with Mistress Death. And what he tells us is that he laments the idea, he hates the idea of traveling through the cosmos and wiping out the natives of various planets in order to consume those planets. But Mistress Death assuages this guilt that he has by simply saying it's the role that he was meant to play, that everybody has a role that they play, that you have characters like Eternity, which are the embodiment of all that is. You have Infinity, which is the embodiment of all that will be. You have all these different characters that play all these different concepts, but that ultimately, regardless of the feelings that Galactus has here, that he's a character that simply has to play this role. And what she's basically saying is that Galactus is a universal constant, but she doesn't really come out and say this here. It's actually not until Fantastic Four, issue number 262, that Marvel comes out and says that Galactus is a universal constant, that this universe has to have Galactus. And in Fantastic Four, issue number 262, Marvel does this by introducing an event called the Trial of Reed Richards. And the reason why this was done was because, again, Galactus, who had consumed other planets, had either, I guess, forced the occupants of those planets to leave, or had wiped out the life on those planets entirely. And so as a result, Reed Richards is brought before the court of the Shi'ar Empire due to his actions in really helping Galactus stave off hunger on a couple different situations and a couple different scenarios here. And so what they say is that because Reed Richards had basically helped Galactus stay alive, that any future planets that may be destroyed here are due to the actions of Reed Richards. And so because Galactus is guaranteed to continue consuming planets, Reed Richards is responsible for all future actions that take place, effectively making Reed Richards a contributor to genocide here. And so what happens is various individuals are brought in, various races testify, testify to the destruction of their planet at the hands of Galactus. We see Odin, for example, stepping in and saying that Reed Richards hadn't really done anything wrong here, that he was, for the most part, maintaining the standard that Galactus simply has to exist in the universe. For them, Galactus is basically a character who exists in the realm of a god, a character who simply just cannot be stopped, and a lot of other races out there that exist in the Marvel continuity view Galactus that way. And what's really intriguing here is that whenever Galactus appears to a race, whenever he appears to another planet, he appears in a form that race will recognize. For example, when he appears to the Skrulls, he appears as a Skrull. When he appears to the planet Earth, he appears as an Earthling or as someone in Earth's form. This is really one of the cool elements of Galactus. But again, it's actually not until towards the end of the comic that Eternity appears. And what Eternity tells us here is that, again, because Galactus was basically birthed into this universe alongside a multitude of other cosmic abstracts, that he has to exist, that he can't not exist, that if Galactus didn't exist, that it would more or less result in a set of circumstances that would lead to the ruin of all. Now again, Eternity doesn't really say this per se. What he actually does is he takes the minds of all these individuals who have existed or who are currently present in this courtroom, and he merges them into one single consciousness, and then he reveals to them the life that Galactus leads here. And so what they more or less begin to do is they come to the realization that Galactus has to exist, that he is a universal constant. And so what we do is we jump to the story of Galactus and the Devourer. Now this was written by Louise Simonson, and this is actually a very pivotal moment in the realm of Marvel Comics. And the reason why is because after Galactus had been established as a universal constant in the trial of Reed Richards, the question that readers had was, what would happen if Galactus were killed? What would happen if he died? If for some reason or another he was removed from the landscape of Marvel Comics? What would be the result? And so during the Galactus the Devourer storyline, we ultimately saw that the Silver Surfer had taken the planet-consuming equipment of Galactus and turned it against Galactus. And so Galactus was effectively feeding on himself, which resulted in Galactus starving to death, more or less, as far as Galactus could starve without a fresh supply of energy. And so as a result, in Fantastic Four Annual 2001, Marvel introduced a villain named Abraxas. And the way they introduced this villain was by simply saying that Abraxas was, or I guess is, the embodiment of the multiverse's destruction. He's really kind of an idea, more or less, that had taken physical form. But prior to the death of Galactus, Abraxas had been non-existent. He had simply just existed as a non-existing entity, if that makes any sense. But because the Earth 616 version of Galactus had ceased to exist because he had starved to death, this opened a door that allowed Abraxas to actually exist, that allowed him to come into the realm of existence, and by virtue, he began hopping across the multiverse and killing off every version of Galactus that he could find. And so what happens is that this story actually jumps into Fantastic Four issues number 46 through 49, I think, in volume 3. And with these stories, or with this story, this conclusion, I guess, what we find is that Franklin Richards, again, with an impressive display of power, is able to restore Galactus from the Earth 616 continuity back to life, who again had previously starved to death. And so when Galactus arrives, he confronts Abraxas. And again, Abraxas really taunts Galactus here by saying that Abraxas has destroyed various other versions of Galactus, and this one will be no different. But what Galactus says is that the ultimate nullifier, which has been wielded by Abraxas, and which of course is capable of more or less resetting the Marvel Universe, of wiping out all life, is something that is very much a part of Galactus himself, in the sense that the two go hand in hand, and that Galactus had created it. And so what happens is Galactus strips Abraxas of the ultimate nullifier, but then is attacked by Frankie Ray, by his Herald Nova. And so because of this, Galactus, I guess the ultimate nullifier, falls into the hands of Reed Richards. And what Reed Richards does is he basically resets the universe prior to the point when Abraxas first appeared, that is to say, when Silver Surfer had killed Galactus. And so as a result, Abraxas ceases to exist. He's simply just not there anymore because Galactus had never died. And so what we do is, again, Marvel goes by, and Marvel really continues on with this concept of Galactus continuing about his normal business. But what they also do in 2004 is they delve more into the heralds of Galactus, because again, a lot of people were very curious about these different heralds. We of course had seen that after the Silver Surfer, we had seen Terrax, we had seen Frankie Ray, we saw some characters like Dazzler who were made into heralds, but only for a temporary time. And so what Marvel did is, during the solo series of Thanos in issues number 11 and number 12, they introduced the character called the Fallen. And the Fallen was, as far as Marvel describes it, the first herald of Galactus, but he had been dismissed by Galactus due to the insane nature of the Fallen, but also because he wouldn't carry out the orders of Galactus. And all that really happens over the course of this story is that the Fallen somehow manages to escape his imprisonment, confronts Galactus, but alongside the help of Thanos, is defeated and ultimately, I guess, eliminated entirely. And so again, what we find is that as things progress, as things continue with Galactus, Galactus is really kind of made a background character here. And the reason why Galactus is made a background character in the Marvel Comics is because, again, Marvel had been branching out into all manner of multiversal threats. With the Infinity Gauntlet storyline, Marvel had basically made it a common trend to have multiversal constructs, to have other characters who were a multiversal threat that were as dangerous or more dangerous than Galactus, including characters like Franklin Richards. And so what we had seen was that this has really all come to a head, that Galactus was really brought back to the mainstream in the eyes of a lot of fans as being such an intriguing character during Jonathan Hickman's run of the Fantastic Four with the Future Foundation. Now, what we had seen with Future Foundation was that, again, with going back to our discussion on Franklin Richards, that there had been a council of Reeds, basically, these different Reed Richards from a multitude of different realities, but they had all joined the council of Reeds and effectively abandoned their families. They had abandoned each version of their own family. And so as a result, Reed Richards had refused to take this role. He had refused to abandon his family. But the Mad Celestials, which were Celestials from an alternate reality, had followed Reed Richards to the Earth 616 continuity. And again, we get into a little more discussion about this, a little more in-depth during this with our discussion on Franklin Richards, which of course I'll have a annotation on the screen for you to check out. But what happens is that ultimately Reed Richards calls Galactus from the Earth 616 continuity to the planet Earth. And when Galactus arrives, he confronts the Mad Celestials. Now, the Mad Celestials are able to combine the three of themselves into a singular being and overpower and basically siphon all of Galactus's energies away, which for all intents and purposes kill Galactus, or at the very least leave him in a very weakened state. And so again, Franklin Richards from the future bonds his energies with his younger self and then makes Galactus his herald. And this was a huge moment for a lot of Marvel comic fans, for Galactus fans. And the reason why is because we had never, ever seen an instance where Galactus had been made the herald of someone else. Galactus had always had his own heralds. He had always bestowed some measure of the power cosmic on his own heralds, but he had never been made into a herald by another being. And so again, this really brought Galactus back to the mainstream. It really made him a forerunner, made him a front-running character. Now, ultimately, this was really a short-lived popularity, and the reason why was because we had seen, as a result of Wolverine's actions in the Age of Ultron storyline, that Galactus was sent, or I guess ejected into the Ultimate Universe by virtue of dimensional and time displacement, which of course picks up with the entire Miles Morales Ultimate Universe and the Ultimate stories. But with Galactus, he's a character who in a lot of ways embodies what it means to oppose a force, or to I guess encounter a force that is nigh unstoppable, that is really only held accountable by other beings who don't really care about the goings-on of Earthbound characters. And even Galactus himself with his power is perceived by a lot of Earthbound characters as being unstoppable in the sense that he wields the power cosmic. And so because he wields the power cosmic, there really isn't anything that he can't do. He's capable of creating entire planets. He can move planets. He can create life. He can bestow other people with the power cosmic, enhance their abilities, or give them new abilities. There really isn't anything that he cannot do. For the most part, Galactus is really kind of in no man's land at the moment, the best way to describe it. He's really kind of in a position where, again, he's kind of shuffled to a background character here. Now, whether or not this will change as time progresses, whether or not as we move closer to Marvel's 2015 summer event, if we'll see him actually step into the mainstream again and become a forerunner, is something we don't really know. All we know is that at this moment, Galactus is again continuing to be a background character. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, let me know, and I will catch you guys later. Peace. Be sure to follow me on Twitter. There you can keep up with all the updates from Comics Explained and talk to me directly.